At 3:45 in the morning of the 10th of April, a 20-year-old man called Daniel Marino Gamma walked up to a $27 million house on Russian Hill in San Francisco and threw a Molotov cocktail at the gate. It bounced off. No one was hurt. An hour later, he was at OpenAI's headquarters in Mission Bay, using a chair to try and break through the glass doors and threatening to burn the building down and kill anyone inside. When the police arrested him, they found incendiary devices, a jug of kerosene and a document listing the names and addresses of AI company board members and CEOs. The manifesto predicted human extinction. That was a Friday. The Monday before, The New Yorker had published a 16,000-word investigation by Ronan, Farrow and Andrew Marantz, the output of 18 months of reporting, more than 100 interviewees and never-before-disclosed internal memos. The first memo, which Ilya Sutskever compiled in the autumn of 2023, opened with a list. The first item was lying. Sutskever was OpenAI's co-founder and chief scientist. He had once counted Altman as a friend. In 2019, he officiated the wedding of Greg Brockman, Altman's second-in-command, at OpenAI's offices, with a ring bearer in the form of a robotic hand. By 2023, he had come to a different view. He wrote it in a memo that he sent to other members of the board as a disappearing message. The memo said, "I don't think Sam is the guy who should have his finger on the button." A senior executive at Microsoft, the company that has invested around $13 billion in OpenAI, told Farrow and Marantz there was a small but real chance he's eventually remembered as the Bernie Madoff or Sam Bankman-Fried level scammer. These are strong views from the people who invested money, sat on the board and built the company. And yet Altman is still the CEO of OpenAI. The firing, when he was temporarily ousted in 2023, did not hold. The New Yorker piece has not moved his position. When the Molotov cocktail hit his gate, he posted a photograph of his family and a blog post that referenced Tolkien. Just weeks before, OpenAI had closed another funding round, valuing the company at over $800 billion. The question this video is going to try and answer is not whether Sam Altman is a good or bad person. The question is why, after 15 years and across multiple institutions, the people who have tried the hardest to remove him have failed, and whether that tells us something about the person who is currently shaping a technology of civilizational consequence. Because what Farrow and Marantz really assembled was not a list of incidents, it was a pattern, and the pattern does not start with a New Yorker article or even 2023. It goes much further back. The clearest early instance comes from Y Combinator. Paul Graham, the founder of YC and Altman's mentor, recruited him as his successor in 2014. Altman was 28. Graham had written about him 6 years earlier and said something that has since become famous. Parachute him onto an island full of cannibals, come back 5 years later, and he would be the king. Graham meant this as a compliment. He was describing a will he considered, in his own phrase, almost ungovernable. By 2018, several YC partners had come to Graham with complaints. Graham and his wife, Jessica Livingston, a YC founder herself, had what Farrow and Marantz described as a frank conversation with Altman. Afterwards, Graham started telling people that Altman had agreed to leave, but was resisting in practice. In May 2019, a blog post announced a new YC president, with an asterisk saying Altman was transitioning to chairman. A few months later, the phrase was edited out. As late as 2021, an SEC filing still listed him as YC chairman. Altman has publicly maintained he was never fired. In private, Graham has told colleagues that Sam had been lying to us all the time. The private story and the public story diverged. The gap between what is said inside the room and what is said outside the room is not incidental to Altman's career. In November 2023, the board of OpenAI famously tried to remove him. They had Sutskever's memo, 70 pages of Slack messages and HR documents, with the images taken by cell phone, apparently to avoid detection on company devices. It alleged that Altman had misrepresented facts about internal safety processes, pitted executives against one another, and given the board inaccurate information about what Microsoft was doing with early versions of ChatGPT. On the 17th of November, Altman was at a Formula One race in Las Vegas. Sutskever invited him to Google Meet. Altman learned over the call that he was no longer an employee of OpenAI. There is a detail from this period that changes how you read all of it. When Altman became CEO in 2019, he made a private deal with Sutskever and Brockman. The deal was a handshake, not a contract, but all three men have since confirmed it existed. Altman agreed he would step down if both Sutskever and Brockman asked him to. Brockman described the promise as purely altruistic. In November 2023, Sutskever asked. The pact was set aside. What happened over the next 72 hours has been covered extensively elsewhere. Thrive Capital put its $86 billion investment on hold, conditional on Altman's return. Satya Nadella offered Altman a role at Microsoft. Most of OpenAI's roughly 770 employees signed a letter saying they would follow. Altman was reinstated on the 22nd. The board members who had voted to fire him were out within weeks. Wilmer Hale conducted an independent review that produced no written report, only oral briefings. It concluded that he could remain as CEO. And then there was an extraordinary moment. During one of the tense calls before his reinstatement, the board pressed Altman to acknowledge a pattern of deception. According to people on the call, he said over and over, "This is just so fucked up. I can't change my personality." When Farrow and Marantz asked him about the line, he said, "It's possible I meant something like, I do try to be a unifying force." A board member gave them a different interpretation. It meant, the board member said, "I have this trait where I lie to people, and I'm not going to stop." Elon Musk, who co-founded OpenAI in 2015 and has since left the board, filed suit in 2024 alleging that Altman and OpenAI had defrauded him about the company's non-profit mission. In January, the federal judge ruled there was plenty of evidence for a jury to consider, citing Greg Brockman's diary entries. The trial began on the 27th of April in Oakland and is ongoing at the time of this video's release. For the first time, the pattern is going to be examined by an institution with the power to force its own conclusions. The question to me is not whether the pattern exists. It clearly does. The question is why it keeps working. The cleanest description comes from Carroll Wainwright, a former OpenAI researcher, who told Farrow and Marantz he sets up structures that, on paper, constrain him in the future, but then when the future comes and it comes time to be constrained, he does away with whatever the structure was. Wainwright is describing a process. Structures are set up only to be dismantled. The structures do not always look cynical when they are being set up. They often look like genuine commitments. The mechanism is only visible in retrospect. The clearest single example is the 2019 Microsoft negotiation. A year earlier, Dario Amodei, who was leading OpenAI's safety team, had drafted a new charter for the company. The most radical clause in it was what he called the merge and assist provision. If another lab, acting safely, built AGI first, OpenAI would stop competing and help them. By any normal corporate logic, this was an insane thing to promise. But OpenAI was not supposed to be a normal company. When the Microsoft deal was being negotiated, Amodei gave Altman a ranked list of safety demands, with preservation of the merge and assist clause at the top. Altman agreed. In June, as the deal was closing, Amodei discovered that a provision had been added giving Microsoft the power to block OpenAI from any mergers. By his reckoning, 80% of the charter had just been betrayed. He confronted Altman, who denied the provision existed. Amodei read the text aloud. Altman continued to deny. Amodei eventually brought in another colleague who confirmed the provision in Altman's presence, at which point Altman said he did not remember. This is what Wainwright was describing. The structure was set up with visible care. The commitment was made. The commitment was dismantled. And the dismantling was denied even in the face of the text that did the dismantling. Amodei, who left OpenAI in 2020 to co-found Anthropic, later wrote in more than 200 pages of private notes titled "My Experience with OpenAI, the problem with OpenAI is Sam himself." Another level on which this pattern operates is through language. Altman is, by the consensus of the people who have worked with him, an extraordinary pitchman. One tech executive told Farrow and Marantz he's unbelievably persuasive, like Jedi mind tricks. He's just next level. What is notable is not just that his language is persuasive, it is that it often carries two arguments at once. In 2023, shortly before his firing, he said this about large language models. If you just do the naive thing and say never say anything that you're not 100% sure about, you can get a model to do that. But it won't have the magic that people like so much. The comment was about LLMs. Read in context, it was also an argument that truthfulness and appeal are in tension, and that some level of fabrication is a feature rather than a bug. You see the same doubleness in his fundraising pitches. In 2017, Altman told US intelligence officials that China had launched what he called an AGI Manhattan project, and that OpenAI needed billions of dollars of government funding to keep pace. When pressed for evidence, he said, "I've heard things." He never followed up. The intelligence official who looked into it later concluded that it was just being used as a sales pitch. The existential framing and the commercial ask were the same sentence. Not in the sense that Altman was being insincere about the risks, in the sense that the risks were doing the commercial work. Fear and fundraising were fused. So that is the patterns mechanism. Structures are set up and dismantled. Language carries two arguments at once. The reason it keeps working, to a first approximation, is that the skill is genuinely rare. Raising hundreds of billions of dollars for AI compute is something very few people can do. Persuading skittish researchers and cautious regulators to align behind a single vision is also something very few people can do. What Wainwright described is not separable from the capacity to build a company from nothing to $1 trillion valuation. The same thing that makes Altman hard to constrain is what makes him effective. This is the honest version of the defense. As Ron Conway, the investor, put it, his mission is measured by numbers. And when you look at the success of OpenAI, it's hard to argue with the numbers. The argument holds, though, only if the structures that were dismantled were trivial. If they were actually important, the question is not whether the mechanism is a feature of effective leadership. It's what it has cost. The first thing it has cost is OpenAI's own safety program. In July 2023, the company announced a team called Superalignment. The stated goal was to solve the technical problem of aligning superintelligent AI within 4 years, before a superintelligent system arrived. The public pledge was 20% of the compute the company had secured to date. OpenAI described it as necessary because otherwise, AGI might lead to the disempowerment of humanity or even human extinction. 4 people who worked on the team told Farrow and Marantz that the actual compute allocation was between 1 and 2%, much of it on the oldest cluster with the worst chips. Jan Laker, who co-led the team with Ilya Sutskever, complained to Mira Marathi, who told him the 20% commitment had never been realistic. In May 2024, Sutskever and Laker resigned. Superalignment was dissolved within days, along with a separate team tasked with preparing society for advanced AI. When Farrow and Marantz asked to interview researchers at OpenAI working on existential safety, a company representative replied, What do you mean by existential safety? That's not like a thing. The second cost is more recent. In late February, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth summoned Dario Amodei to the Pentagon. Anthropic's usage policies bar the company from enabling fully autonomous weapons or domestic mass surveillance. Hegseth wanted the restrictions removed and gave Amodei until 5:01 on Friday afternoon to agree. Amodei declined. Hegseth designated Anthropic a supply chain risk, a blacklist previously reserved for foreign adversaries like Hawaii. Hundreds of employees at OpenAI and Google signed an open letter titled "We Will Not Be Divided, Defending Anthropic." Altman wrote an internal memo claiming OpenAI shared Anthropic's ethical boundaries. Here's what was actually happening. Emil Michael, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, told Farrow Marantz on the record that he had been in contact with Altman for at least 2 days before the deadline. Michael's description: "I called Sam and he was willing to jump. I think he's a patriot." Altman's question to him: "What can I do for the country?" On the Friday morning of the deadline, a $50 billion deal integrated OpenAI's technology into Amazon Web Services, which is part of the Pentagon's digital infrastructure. That evening, Altman announced on X that the military would now be using OpenAI's models. At a staff meeting afterwards, Altman addressed employees who had raised concerns. According to Farrow Marantz, he said, "So maybe you think the Iran strike was good and the Venezuela invasion was bad. You don't get to weigh in on that." 5 weeks later, on the 11th of April, the morning after the Molotov attack, Altman published a blog post in which he wrote that power cannot be too concentrated, and that control of the future belongs to all people and their institutions. The same person wrote both sentences. 5 weeks earlier, he had told his own employees that they didn't get to weigh in. That blog post might be the purest example in the whole story of the mechanism operating at its highest level. The post opens with a photograph of Altman's family and a plea that it might dissuade the next person from throwing a Molotov cocktail at his house. After acknowledging the attack and the New Yorker piece, he offers a metaphor. "My personal takeaway from the last several years, and take on why there has been so much Shakespearean drama between the companies in our field, comes down to this. Once you see AGI, you can't unsee it. It has a real ring of power dynamic to it, and makes people do crazy things." The reference is to Tolkien. In The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring is a corrupting object. Anyone who holds it bends to its will, however good their original intentions. The moral architecture of the story is not that the ring should be shared, it is that the ring should be destroyed. Altman's reframing is that the ring is not AGI itself, but the totalizing philosophy of being the one to control AGI. His proposed solution is to share the technology broadly, so that no one has the ring. The metaphor is, on its surface, humble. Nobody should have this, myself included. But look what it is doing. Altman, in this telling, is the one who has seen the ring for what it is, the one warning about its dangers, but also the one advocating for distribution rather than concentration. The people who have tried to remove him are, in this frame, either naive or corrupted by their own desire for the ring. In Tolkien, a genuine ring bearer is trying to give it up. Frodo does not write a blog post about the burden of carrying the ring. He treks to Mount Doom and throws it in the fire. The person who posts a reflection on the ring's dangers shortly after consolidating power through a for-profit restructuring currently being litigated as a fraud is doing something different from what the metaphor claims. This is Wainwright's description at its highest level of operation. A structure is set up, the admission that a dangerous power dynamic exists. The structure is dismantled, the speaker is exempted from it. The whole thing happens in a paragraph of ordinary prose, which is why it works. Of course, Sam Altman does have wide-ranging support from OpenAI employees and investors, and he's a media operator with plenty of fans. So there's also a solid case for the defense. The strongest version is something like this. Every transformative technology has been built by figures who bent reality around themselves. Edison, Ford, Rockefeller, Jobs, Bezos, Elon Musk. The persuasion-first CEO is constitutive of the role, not incidental. To insist on a leadership style that excludes what Altman does is to insist on a different kind of company. And that different kind of company would not have raised the hundreds of billions of dollars required to build large-scale AI. Altman, in his blog post, put it briefly. A lot of companies say they are going to change the world. We actually did. This is not nothing. OpenAI raised the capital no non-profit AI lab had been able to raise. It released the product that defined the moment and remains the most widely used chatbot. And the accusations against Altman, the ones the New Yorker piece documents, are not accusations of financial crime or personal misconduct. They're about professional truthfulness and governance. That distinction matters and should not be blurred. Andrew Marantz, who co-wrote the New Yorker piece, spoke about it on a podcast after publication.
But I don't think anyone should walk away from this piece thinking like, oh, Sam Altman shouldn't be the AGI dictator like Elon should, or Demis should, or Greg Brockman should, right? Like, obviously, I think the structural takeaway here is closer to like, who is vesting these dudes with this amount of power?
The pattern is specific to Altman. The structure that lets it run unchecked is not. But whether that structure is fixable on any timeline that matters is a separate question. And the 2023 firing is not encouraging evidence. There is something murkier within all this. Alongside the documented material, there is an unusual volume of unsubstantiated rumour about Altman, some of it circulated by opposition research dossiers that Farrow and Marantz traced to Musk-linked intermediaries. The reporters spent months on the most serious of the allegations and found no evidence. The proliferation of unverified rumour is itself part of the story. Altman has become the subject of extraordinary accusations while remaining difficult to pin down on verifiable ones. So what is the honest position? Not that the critics are right and the defenders are wrong. Not the reverse. It is that we cannot know who Sam Altman is, in part because the evidence we have for answering that question, his public language, his institutional behaviour, the accounts of the people who have worked with him, is the evidence he is demonstrably skilled at managing. But we can observe a distinct pattern across Y Combinator and OpenAI that is documented. The dismantled safety teams are documented, as is the Pentagon episode, and the Moday's 200 pages of notes. None of this requires knowing Altman's inner state. All of it actually happened. The Silicon Valley institutions designed to hold him accountable have demonstrably struggled to do so. I want to finish by coming back to the photograph in his blog post the morning after the Molotov cocktail attack. A 40-year-old tech CEO under federal investigation for the second week in a row, a husband, a 1-year-old son, a plea for de-escalation. The subject of a 16,000-word piece documenting a decade of disputed encounters. A man whose defining trait, by the consensus of those who have worked most closely with him, is that he cannot be pinned down. You can read the photograph sympathetically. A father frightened for his family after an attack on his home. You can read it as another calibrated gesture by someone for whom everything is calibrated. The honest truth is that both readings are available, and we cannot tell them apart. That is the story in one image. The Molotov cocktail attack was obviously wrong. The attacker was disturbed. Nobody's violent demands should determine what happens next. But the institutions designed to hold this man to account have failed to do so. The technology he is building is not decelerating. His company is preparing for an IPO at a valuation approaching $1 trillion. A jury in Oakland is currently examining the pattern under oath. Strip away the valuations, the boardroom drama and the Tolkien metaphors, and what is left is a man's relationship with the truth. That relationship is documented. The institutions designed to enforce it have a history of failure. The future may not be kind to that. You've been watching Absolutely Agentic. We're a media consultancy and startup focused on AI, and we create weekly YouTube videos and a newsletter we send a few times a week. In a world of AI hype, we're trying to strike a balance, looking at a range of opinions to cut through an increasingly complex world. The best thing you can do to support us is to sign up to the newsletter in the description or subscribe to the channel. But also don't forget to like and leave us a friendly comment. See you next time. It'll be absolutely agentic.